December 29, 2019, Kansai International Airport, Osaka, Japan. A private jet sat on the tarmac, engines running, cleared for departure. Inside the cargo hold, among the equipment cases and luggage, was a large black box, the kind used to transport audio gear for concerts, heavy, reinforced, unremarkable. Airport security had scanned it, cleared it, loaded it onto the plane. Nobody looked inside. If they had, they would have found Carlos Ghosn, one of the most powerful executives in the world, the man who had saved Nissan, the CEO who ran a $100 billion automotive empire, the leader who had been arrested, charged with financial crimes, and placed under house arrest in Tokyo while awaiting trial. He was supposed to be in Japan, monitored, tracked, confined. Instead, he was folded into a box with air holes punched in the sides, being smuggled out of the country like contraband. The jet took off. It stopped briefly in Turkey, then continued to Beirut, Lebanon. By the time Japanese authorities realized what had happened, Ghosn was gone, beyond their reach, beyond their jurisdiction, free. Days later, he appeared at a press conference in Beirut, not apologetic, not humbled, defiant. He called his escape an act of survival. He accused Japan of persecution. He framed himself as a victim fleeing an unjust system. But the prosecutors in Tokyo saw something else, a fugitive, a man who had been caught, charged with hiding millions in compensation and misusing corporate funds, and who had chosen to run rather than face trial. The escape was so brazen, so cinematic that it felt like fiction. A CEO hidden in a music box, smuggled through airport security, flown across continents. It was the kind of story that gets turned into movies, but it was real. And it was the final act in one of the most spectacular falls from grace in corporate history. Carlos Ghosn had been untouchable. He had turned around Nissan when everyone said it was impossible. He had built an alliance between Nissan, Renault, and Mitsubishi that became one of the largest automotive groups in the world. He had been celebrated in Japan, praised in France, studied in business schools. He had appeared on magazine covers. He had testified before governments. He had been called a genius, a savior, a legend. And then, in a single day, it all came crashing down. November 19, 2018, Ghosn's private jet landed in Tokyo. He stepped off the plane expecting another routine business trip. Instead, prosecutors were waiting. He was arrested on the tarmac, taken into custody, charged with financial misconduct. Within hours, the news was everywhere. The man who had saved Nissan was accused of stealing from it. The world was stunned. How could this happen? Was it real? Was it a setup? Had Ghosn been caught in a crime? Or was this a corporate coup disguised as justice? Nobody knew. And for more than a year, the case played out in slow motion, detention, bail, house arrest, legal battles, a trial that promised to answer the questions but never came because Ghosn decided not to wait for a verdict. He decided the system was rigged, that he would not get a fair trial, that his only option was to run, and so he did, hidden in a box, smuggled like cargo, escaping to a country that would not send him back. Now he sits in Beirut, free but exiled, safe but trapped, unable to travel, unable to reclaim his life, unable to clear his name. The charges are still active, the arrest warrant is still out there, and the truth, whether Carlos Ghosn was a corrupt executive who stole millions or a victim of a conspiracy by rivals in a broken justice system, remains contested. This is the story of how he rose, how he fell, and how he refused to face the consequences. Before we begin, hit subscribe, because this is not just about one man, it is about power, accountability, and what happens when leaders become untouchable, about systems that fail to stop misconduct until it is too late, about the choice between facing justice and running from it. The next Carlos Ghosn is already out there, accumulating power, delivering results, telling a story people want to believe. The question is whether anyone will ask the hard questions before it is too late. Now let's go back to the beginning, back to when Carlos Ghosn was not a fugitive in a box but a hero saving a dying company, back to when everyone believed in him. Carlos Ghosn stepped off a private jet and walked into a country with no extradition treaty with Japan. The man who had once run a $100 billion automotive empire, who had been celebrated as one of the greatest executives in the world, was now a fugitive. He had been under house arrest in Tokyo, monitored, tracked, his movements restricted, his passport confiscated. He was awaiting trial on charges of financial misconduct that could have sent him to prison for decades, and then somehow he vanished, not quietly, not through legal channels. He escaped Japan hidden inside a large black case used for transporting music equipment, smuggled through airport security, loaded onto a private jet, and flown out of the country. By the time Japanese authorities realized he was gone, he was already in Lebanon, holding a press conference, proclaiming his innocence, and accusing the Japanese justice system of persecution. It was one of the most audacious corporate escapes in history. and it was the final act in a fall from grace so dramatic that it felt scripted. This is the story of Carlos Ghosn, the executive who saved one of the world's largest car companies, the man worshipped as a turnaround genius, the leader who became too powerful, too comfortable, and, according to prosecutors, too willing to treat corporate money as his own. This is the story of how he rose to the top, how he fell harder than almost anyone in corporate history, and how he refused to face the consequences. Before the scandal, before the arrest, before the escape, Carlos Ghosn was a legend. Born in Brazil to Lebanese parents, raised in Lebanon and educated in France, Ghosn was a global citizen long before that was fashionable. He studied engineering at some of France's most prestigious schools. He was brilliant, driven, and fluent in multiple languages. He joined Renault, the French automaker, and quickly made a name for himself as someone who could cut costs and turn struggling operations around. He earned a nickname, Le Cost Killer. It was not meant as a compliment, but Ghosn wore it like a badge of honor. In 1999, Renault sent him to Japan with an impossible mission: save Nissan. Nissan was dying. It had been one of Japan's great industrial champions, but by the late 1990s it was drowning in debt, losing market share, and on the verge of collapse. The company owed more than $20 billion. Its plants were inefficient. Its product lineup was stale. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Ghosn arrived as an outsider, a foreigner in a deeply insular corporate culture, a cost cutter in a country that valued loyalty and lifetime employment. Nobody expected him to succeed. Many expected him to fail spectacularly. He did not fail. Within 2 years, Ghosn had restructured Nissan. He closed plants, he cut jobs, he renegotiated supplier contracts, he killed underperforming models and invested in new ones. He broke unwritten rules about how Japanese companies operated, and he did it without apology. And it worked. Nissan returned to profitability. The stock price soared. The company that had been left for dead was alive again. Ghosn became a hero. In Japan, a country that rarely celebrates foreign executives, he was treated like a rock star. Manga comics featured him as a character. He appeared on magazine covers. Business schools studied his turnaround as a case study in decisive leadership. He was not just a CEO, he was a symbol, proof that bold leadership could overcome impossible odds. Renault and Nissan formalized their partnership into an alliance. Ghosn became CEO of both companies, an unprecedented arrangement. Later, Mitsubishi joined the alliance, and Ghosn took control of that too. At its peak, the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance was one of the largest automotive groups in the world, selling more than 10 million vehicles a year. And Ghosn stood at the center of it all, running 3 companies simultaneously, jetting between Paris, Tokyo, and board meetings around the globe. He was one of the most powerful executives on the planet. His compensation reflected that. He earned millions, tens of millions every year. He lived in luxury. He had access to private jets, corporate apartments, lavish events. From the outside, it looked like the reward for extraordinary success. A man who had saved companies and created value deserved to be paid accordingly. But inside Nissan, resentment was building. What made Carlos Ghosn so convincing was not just his track record, it was his image. He presented himself as a hands-on leader who understood operations, who made tough calls, who delivered results. He was not a finance guy shuffling spreadsheets. He was an engineer who had worked his way up, who understood how factories ran, who could talk to workers and executives alike. He wrote books about leadership. He gave speeches at conferences. He was invited to Davos, to think tanks, to government meetings. World leaders wanted to meet him. Business schools wanted him as a guest lecturer. He cultivated this image carefully. The outsider who succeeded where insiders failed. The global executive who transcended borders. The pragmatist who made hard decisions and turned companies around. And for years it worked. Nobody questioned him, nobody challenged him. He had delivered results. His companies were profitable. His reputation was untouchable. But inside Nissan, the cracks were spreading. Some executives resented the way Ghosn centralized power. He made decisions unilaterally. He sidelined rivals. He controlled everything from Tokyo to Paris, and the executives below him had little autonomy. There were also whispers about money, about expenses that seemed excessive, about corporate funds being used for personal benefit, about compensation arrangements that were not fully disclosed. For years, these whispers stayed internal. Ghosn was too powerful, too successful, too celebrated. Challenging him seemed futile. And as long as the companies were profitable, shareholders and boards were willing to look the other way. But by the mid-2010s, tensions within the alliance were rising. Nissan executives, particularly in Japan, felt increasingly sidelined by Renault. There were discussions about merging the two companies more formally, giving Renault even greater control. For some Nissan executives, this was unacceptable. They saw Ghosn not as a savior but as a threat, a foreign executive who had used Nissan's recovery to build his own empire and was now preparing to hand control to the French government, which owned a significant stake in Renault. A quiet rebellion began. Executives started gathering evidence. They reviewed compensation records, they traced expenses, they documented trips, properties, payments, and what they found was damning. The accusations, when they finally went public, were devastating. Carlos Ghosn was accused of hiding tens of millions of dollars in compensation. Japanese law required executives to disclose their full pay. Ghosn had reported some of his salary, but not all of it. Prosecutors alleged he had deferred significant portions of his compensation, keeping them off the books to avoid disclosure and taxes. He was also accused of using corporate funds for personal expenses. Luxury homes in Paris, Rio de Janeiro, Beirut, and Amsterdam, properties owned or paid for by Nissan and Renault, allegedly for Ghosn's personal use. Lavish parties at the Palace of Versailles, private jets used for family vacations, payments to family members. The allegations painted a picture of an executive who had come to see the companies he ran as personal fiefdoms, their treasuries as his own. On November 19, 2018, Carlos Ghosn's private jet landed in Tokyo. He was returning from a business trip. As he stepped off the plane, Japanese prosecutors were waiting. He was arrested on the tarmac, no warning, no chance to prepare. He was taken into custody, and within hours the news was everywhere. Carlos Ghosn, the titan of the auto industry, the man who had saved Nissan, was under arrest for financial crimes. The world was stunned. How could this happen? Was this real, or was it a setup? Had Ghosn been caught in a genuine crime, or was this a corporate coup disguised as law enforcement? The answers depended on who you asked. Prosecutors said the evidence was clear. Ghosn had broken the law, and no amount of success excused that. But Ghosn's supporters saw something darker, a conspiracy by Nissan executives and Japanese authorities to remove a powerful foreigner who had become inconvenient. Ghosn was held in a Tokyo detention center under conditions that shocked many in the West. He was interrogated for hours without a lawyer present. He was denied bail for weeks. He was kept in a small cell with limited contact with the outside world. In Japan, this was standard procedure for white-collar suspects. The justice system operates on the assumption that detention prevents evidence tampering and ensures cooperation. Conviction rates are extraordinarily high, over 99%, and defendants often face intense pressure to confess. For Ghosn, who was used to boardrooms and private jets, the experience was brutal. He later described it as psychological torture, designed to break him. Eventually, he was released on bail under strict conditions. He had to surrender his passports. He was confined to Japan. His movements were monitored. Cameras were installed in his residence. He could not contact certain individuals, including his wife. He was free, but barely, and the trial ahead looked grim. If convicted, he faced years in prison. That was when he decided to run. The escape was meticulously planned. The details that emerged later read like a thriller. Ghosn had help. Professional operatives, allegedly including a former US Green Beret and his son, were hired to extract him from Japan. The plan was audacious: smuggle him out of the country in a way that bypassed all security. On December 29, 2019, Ghosn left his residence in Tokyo. He was supposed to be under house arrest, but there were brief windows when he was not directly monitored. He met his accomplices. They moved quickly. Ghosn was placed inside a large, black case, the kind used to transport audio equipment for concerts. The case had air holes. It was large enough to fit a man, but not so large that it looked suspicious. The case was loaded onto a private jet at Osaka's Kansai International Airport. Security scanned it, but not thoroughly. Private jets face lighter scrutiny than commercial flights. The assumption is that wealthy passengers and their cargo are low risk. The jet took off. Ghosn, hidden inside the case, was in the air. He stopped briefly in Turkey, then continued to Beirut, Lebanon. By the time Japanese authorities realized he was gone, it was too late. Ghosn was in Lebanon, a country with no extradition treaty with Japan. He was beyond their reach. Days later, he held a press conference. He appeared defiant, not apologetic. He claimed he had fled, not from justice, but from injustice. He accused the Japanese system of persecution, of denying him a fair trial, of using detention as punishment before conviction. He denied the charges. He framed himself as a victim of a corporate conspiracy led by Nissan executives who wanted him gone, and a legal system that was rigged against foreigners. The escape made global headlines. It was audacious, it was dramatic, and it raised uncomfortable questions. Had Ghosn been right to flee? Was Japan's justice system truly fair? Or was this simply a guilty man running from accountability? The aftermath was messy. Japan issued an arrest warrant. Interpol issued a red notice. Ghosn became one of the most wanted corporate fugitives in the world, but he remained in Lebanon, protected by a combination of politics, nationality, and the lack of an extradition agreement. Lebanese authorities showed no interest in handing him over. Some saw him as a national hero, a Lebanese success story being persecuted by a foreign government. The operatives who helped him escape were not as lucky. The former Green Beret and his son were arrested in the United States, extradited to Japan, and sentenced to prison for their role in the operation. Ghosn's legal team mounted a public relations campaign. They released documents, gave interviews, and argued that the charges were fabricated, but without Ghosn present to face trial, the claims could not be tested in court. Nissan, meanwhile, moved on. New leadership took over. The company distanced itself from Ghosn, framing him as a corrupt executive whose misconduct had damaged the brand. The alliance with Renault became strained, and the vision of a fully merged global automotive giant faded. Renault faced its own reckoning. French authorities investigated Ghosn's use of company funds. Some charges were filed, others were dropped. The company's reputation was damaged, but it survived. For Ghosn, life in Lebanon became a strange kind of exile. He was free but trapped. He could not travel to most countries without risking arrest. His fortune, once vast, was tied up in legal battles. His reputation, once unassailable, was in ruins. He continued to proclaim his innocence. He gave interviews. He released a book. He argued that history would vindicate him, but history is written by those who show up. And Ghosn, by fleeing, ensured that the questions about his guilt or innocence would never be answered in a courtroom. The Carlos Ghosn saga is not just about one man, it's about power, accountability, and the fragility of corporate empires built on personality. Ghosn was celebrated because he delivered results, but results in the end were not enough. When the accusations came, the same boards and shareholders who had celebrated him turned quickly. His success did not buy him loyalty, it bought him temporary protection, and when that protection evaporated, he was alone. The escape also exposed uncomfortable truths about global justice. Ghosn exploited gaps between legal systems. He used wealth and connections to evade accountability, and he found refuge in a country willing to protect him for political and cultural reasons. Is that justice, or is it just proof that the rich and powerful play by different rules? The answer depends on what you believe about Ghosn. If he was guilty, the escape was an act of cowardice, a refusal to face consequences. If he was framed, it was an act of survival, a refusal to be destroyed by a system rigged against him. What is certain is that the story is not over. Ghosn remains in Lebanon, the charges remain active, and somewhere in boardrooms and legal offices the question lingers. What really happened? Carlos Ghosn saved Nissan, then he lost everything. Whether he deserved to lose it or whether he was betrayed by the very company he saved is a question that may never be answered, because the man at the center of it all chose not to stay and fight. He chose to run, and in running he ensured that we will never know the full truth. The fallout from Ghosn's escape rippled far beyond boardrooms and courtrooms. It touched everyone who had believed in him, invested in the companies he led, or worked under his leadership. For Nissan employees, the scandal was a betrayal. Many had admired Ghosn, they had believed in the turnaround story. They had endured plant closures and layoffs because they were told it was necessary to save the company, and now they learned that while they sacrificed, their CEO had allegedly been living in luxury on corporate funds, hiding compensation and treating the company treasury as a personal account. The anger was profound, not just at Ghosn, but at the system that had allowed it. How had he operated with such impunity for so long? Where were the auditors? Where were the board members? Where were the checks and balances that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of misconduct? The answers were uncomfortable. Ghosn had been too powerful. He ran multiple companies. He sat on boards that were supposed to oversee him. He controlled the flow of information. And because he delivered results, because the stock prices were up and the companies were profitable, nobody wanted to ask hard questions. Success had become its own justification. And that created a culture where warning signs were ignored, where dissent was silenced, and where one man accumulated more power than any executive should ever hold. For shareholders, the damage was financial and reputational. Nissan's stock took a hit. Renault's stock fell. The alliance, once celebrated as a model of cross-border cooperation, became a symbol of dysfunction and mistrust. Investors who had poured money into these companies because of Ghosn's track record now faced losses. Some sued, others simply sold and moved on. But the trust was broken. The narrative of Ghosn as the turnaround genius was replaced by Ghosn as the cautionary tale. The media, which had once elevated Ghosn to near mythical status, turned on him with equal intensity. The same outlets that had published glowing profiles now dissected every accusation. The manga character became a punchline. The hero became a villain, but the story was more complicated than simple villainy, because even as the accusations mounted, doubt lingered. Was Ghosn guilty of everything he was accused of? Or was some of this a corporate coup dressed up as law enforcement? The timing of the arrest was suspicious. It came just as discussions about merging Nissan and Renault were intensifying, discussions that threatened to shift control away from Japanese executives. The arrest stopped those talks cold. It removed Ghosn from power, and it ensured that Nissan would remain, at least partially, independent. Some observers saw this as evidence of conspiracy. They argued that Ghosn had indeed broken rules, but that the rules were selectively enforced, that other executives had engaged in similar behavior without facing prosecution, that Ghosn was targeted not because he was uniquely guilty, but because he was uniquely inconvenient. Others countered that this was simply how powerful people deflect accountability, that Ghosn had broken the law, that the evidence was clear, and that crying conspiracy was a way to avoid facing the consequences. Both narratives had elements of truth, and that ambiguity is what made the Ghosn case so difficult to parse. It was not a simple story of a corrupt executive caught red-handed. It was a story tangled in corporate politics, national interests, cultural clashes, and legal systems that operated on fundamentally different principles. The escape itself became a Rorschach test. Was it an act of desperation by a man facing unjust persecution? Or was it proof that Ghosn had always believed the rules did not apply to him? The operatives who helped him escape paid a steep price. Michael Taylor, the former U.S. Green Beret, and his son Peter were arrested in Massachusetts in 2020. Japan requested their extradition. The Taylors fought it, arguing that they would not receive a fair trial in Japan, that the conditions of detention were inhumane, that extradition would violate their rights. They lost. In 2021, they were extradited to Japan, tried and convicted of helping Ghosn escape. Michael Taylor was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Peter received a shorter sentence. They served their time in the same harsh detention system that Ghosn had fled. Their conviction raised its own questions. Should they have been extradited? Were they simply hired professionals doing a job? Or were they complicit in helping a fugitive evade justice? And why were they held accountable while Ghosn remained free? The answer again came down to power and geography. The Taylors were within reach of the law, Ghosn was not. Justice, it seemed, was less about guilt or innocence and more about who could be caught. Ghosn's wife Carol also became entangled in the saga. Japanese authorities issued a warrant for her arrest, accusing her of perjury related to the case. She, like her husband, remained outside Japan, beyond the reach of prosecutors. She became another fugitive in the Ghosn story, another person who chose exile over facing the Japanese legal system. For Carlos Ghosn, life in Beirut was comfortable by most standards, but it was still a cage. He lived in a spacious home, he had resources, he could move freely within Lebanon, but he could not travel. He could not visit his children if they lived in countries with extradition treaties. He could not attend events, sign deals, or reclaim any semblance of the global life he once led. He remained defiant. He gave interviews where he reiterated his innocence, where he described the Japanese system as barbaric, where he framed himself as a victim of a witch hunt. He released documents he claimed proved his case. He pointed to inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence, but without a trial, none of it mattered. He could argue his case in the media, but he could not clear his name in a courtroom, and the longer he stayed in exile, the more his protestations of innocence rang hollow, because if he was truly innocent, why not stay and fight? Why not trust the legal process? Why flee like a guilty man? His answer was always the same: the process was rigged, the conviction rate in Japan was too high, the detention conditions were designed to break defendants. He would not have received a fair trial. There was truth to that. Japan's justice system operates differently than Western systems. The presumption of innocence is weaker. Detention is used as a tool to pressure confessions. Trials are slow and acquittals are rare, but fleeing did not prove innocence, it only proved fear, and whether that fear was justified or simply convenient remained an open question. The Nissan that emerged from the scandal was a changed company. New leadership took over, promising transparency and accountability. Internal reviews were conducted. Governance structures were reformed. The company tried to distance itself from the Ghosn era, but the damage was deep. Nissan's reputation had been tarnished. Sales slumped. The alliance with Renault became strained, with trust between the partners eroded. Mitsubishi, the third member of the alliance, struggled to find its footing in the new reality. The vision that Ghosn had built, of a unified global automotive powerhouse, fractured. Instead of collaboration, there was suspicion. Instead of shared strategy, there were separate paths. The alliance survived, but it was weakened, a shadow of what it had once been. Renault faced its own challenges. French authorities investigated Ghosn's use of company resources. Some charges were filed. Ghosn was accused of misusing corporate funds for personal events, including a lavish party at Versailles. Renault clawed back some of his compensation. The company, like Nissan, tried to move on, but the questions lingered. How had this happened? How had one man been allowed to operate with so little oversight? Why had boards, auditors, and regulators failed to catch the misconduct earlier? The answers pointed to systemic failures. Ghosn had been a celebrity CEO, and celebrity creates its own gravity. People deferred to him. They assumed he knew best. They did not want to challenge someone who had delivered such extraordinary results. This is a recurring theme in corporate scandals. Success breeds complacency. Leaders who deliver results are given more and more power, and that power, unchecked, creates opportunities for abuse. The Carlos Ghosn case became a lesson in corporate governance, taught in business schools alongside Enron and WorldCom, but like those cases, the lesson was easier to teach than to apply, because in the moment when a CEO is delivering growth and profits, it is hard to question them. It feels risky, it feels disloyal, and so the cycle repeats. The next charismatic leader emerges, the next turnaround story captivates investors, the next set of warning signs gets ignored because the results look good, until one day they do not, and by then it is too late. The geopolitical dimension of the Ghosn case also revealed uncomfortable truths about how justice works, or does not work, across borders. Ghosn exploited gaps in the international legal system. He used his Lebanese citizenship as a shield. Lebanon does not extradite its own nationals, a policy rooted in the country's complex political and sectarian dynamics. For Ghosn, it was a lifeline, but it also exposed how uneven global justice is. If you have the right passport, the right resources, and the right connections, you can evade accountability. If you do not, you face the full weight of the law. This is not unique to Ghosn. Wealthy fugitives have long used jurisdictional arbitrage to avoid prosecution. They set up residences in non-extradition countries. They move assets through opaque legal structures. They hire lawyers and public relations firms to muddy the waters, and often they succeed because the systems designed to hold them accountable are fragmented, under-resourced, and easily gamed by people with money and expertise. Fixing this would require unprecedented international cooperation. Treaties would need to be strengthened, enforcement would need to be coordinated, countries would need to agree on standards and procedures. But that is politically difficult. National sovereignty is jealously guarded. Countries compete for wealthy residents and their capital, and systems that allow fugitives to escape also serve other interests, diplomatic, economic, strategic. So the gaps remain, and people like Carlos Ghosn slip through them. One of the most haunting aspects of the Ghosn story is how it ended, or rather, how it did not end. There was no trial, no verdict, no closure. Just an executive in exile, prosecutors with an open warrant, and a global audience left to draw its own conclusions. For some, Ghosn is guilty. The evidence is clear. He hid compensation, misused corporate funds, and fled rather than face justice. His escape was an admission of guilt. For others, he is a victim, targeted by rivals, persecuted by a system designed to extract confessions, denied a fair trial. His escape was an act of self-preservation. The truth most likely lies somewhere in between. Ghosn probably did break rules, but the enforcement of those rules was probably selective. He was guilty of something, but perhaps not everything, and the system that came after him was flawed, even if his conduct was too. But because he fled, we will never know for certain. The trial that could have tested the evidence, cross-examined witnesses, and reached a verdict will never happen. The questions will remain unanswered, and that ambiguity is its own kind of damage. It corrodes trust, it feeds conspiracy theories. It allows everyone to believe what they want to believe. Carlos Ghosn saved Nissan. That much is undeniable. His leadership turned around a company on the brink of collapse. Thousands of jobs were preserved, billions in value were created, but he also allegedly abused his power. He treated corporate resources as personal wealth. He hid compensation. He lived in luxury while workers faced cuts, and when the reckoning came, he ran. That is his legacy. Not just the turnaround, not just the allegations, but the refusal to face them, the choice to live in exile rather than answer for his actions. Whether that makes him a hero or a villain depends on what you believe about power, accountability, and justice, but it makes him undeniably a warning, a reminder that even the most celebrated leaders can fall, that success does not grant immunity, and that when the moment comes to face consequences, character is tested in ways that no boardroom victory can prepare. U4, Carlos Ghosn is still in Lebanon, the charges are still active, the story is still unfinished, and somewhere, another executive is rising, another turnaround story is being written, another leader is accumulating power and adulation. The question is whether anyone is watching closely enough to see the warning signs before it is too late. The legal limbo that Ghosn exists in is both protection and punishment. He cannot be touched by Japanese authorities, but he also cannot move freely. He is trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. This state of permanent exile takes a psychological toll that wealth cannot fully shield against. Ghosn was once a man who moved between continents effortlessly, who commanded rooms in Tokyo, Paris, and boardrooms worldwide. Now his world has shrunk to the borders of Lebanon, a country facing its own deep economic and political crises. Lebanon itself has been in turmoil. The economy collapsed. The banking system froze. Currency lost most of its value. Political dysfunction paralyzed the government. For Ghosn, who fled to Lebanon seeking refuge, the country's instability became another layer of confinement. He watched from the sidelines as the companies he once ran continued without him. Nissan struggled with declining sales and leadership transitions. Renault faced its own challenges in a shifting automotive market. The alliance that was supposed to dominate the global auto industry fragmented into something more fragile and uncertain. And Ghosn, who had once steered all of it, was irrelevant, erased from corporate history, his name removed from buildings, his legacy contested, his achievements overshadowed by scandal. For someone who had defined himself by his work, by his ability to lead and deliver results, this erasure must have been excruciating. He went from being indispensable to invisible, from celebrated to exiled, from powerful to powerless. His attempts to stay relevant, interviews, a book, social media posts, could not restore what he had lost. They were echoes of a past life, attempts to control a narrative that had already moved on without him. The cultural dimension of the Ghosn case also deserves deeper examination. His story became a flashpoint in debates about cross-cultural management, corporate governance, and national identity. In Japan, Ghosn had been a paradox. He was celebrated for saving Nissan, but always viewed as an outsider. His willingness to break traditional Japanese business practices, lifetime employment, keiretsu supplier relationships, consensus decision-making was both his strength and his vulnerability. When the accusations emerged, some in Japan saw it as validation that foreign executives could not be trusted, that Ghosn's disregard for Japanese norms extended to legal and ethical boundaries. The case reinforced stereotypes about cultural incompatibility and the risks of putting too much power in the hands of outsiders. In France, the reaction was more mixed, as some saw Ghosn as a French business success, a leader who had elevated Renault and brought glory to French industry. His arrest was viewed by some as an attack on French interests, a power play by Japanese executives trying to wrest control from Renault. Others in France were less sympathetic. If Ghosn had indeed misused corporate funds, that was unacceptable regardless of nationality, and his flight from justice was embarrassing, a reminder that even celebrated executives could turn out to be frauds. In Lebanon, Ghosn was largely embraced. He was a native son, a Lebanese success story, and his persecution by Japan was framed as an injustice. The fact that Lebanon refused to extradite him was seen by many as a matter of national pride, protecting one of their own from foreign prosecution. But this geopolitical protection came at a cost. It meant Ghosn would never be able to clear his name in a court. It meant he would live under a cloud of suspicion forever. And it meant that the countries whose legal systems he had evaded would never forgive or forget. The enablers in the Ghosn case also faced their own reckoning, though less severe than the man himself. Board members who had overseen Ghosn's compensation were criticized. How had they approved payments and benefits without ensuring full disclosure? How had they allowed one man to accumulate so much unchecked power across multiple companies? Some resigned, others faced shareholder lawsuits, but for the most part the consequences were limited. Board members are insulated by layers of legal protection. Proving that they knowingly enabled misconduct is difficult, and in many cases they could claim they had been misled, that Ghosn had controlled the information they received. Auditors also came under scrutiny. How had they signed off on financial statements year after year without catching the hidden compensation or questionable expenses? Were the audits thorough or were they rubber stamps? The answers revealed the same problems that surface in every major corporate scandal. Auditors rely on management for information. If management lies, if documents are falsified, if the complexity is deliberately designed to obscure, audits can fail. And the incentive structure, where auditors are paid by the companies they audit, creates conflicts that are hard to overcome. Advisors, lawyers, and consultants who had worked with Ghosn also faced uncomfortable questions. Had any of them raised concerns? Had any of them pushed back when something seemed inappropriate? Or had they simply done what they were paid to do, enabling whatever the client wanted? Most stayed quiet. A few spoke anonymously to journalists, describing a culture where questioning Ghosn was career suicide, where loyalty was rewarded and dissent was punished. But public accountability was rare. This is a recurring pattern. When powerful leaders fall, the people around them, the enablers, the advisors, the yes men, rarely face meaningful consequences. They move on to other roles, other companies, other clients. The system absorbs them and continues. The Ghosn case also highlighted the role of whistleblowers in exposing corporate misconduct. The executives inside Nissan who gathered evidence and brought it to prosecutors took significant personal and professional risks. In many corporate cultures, whistleblowers are seen as traitors. They are ostracized, sidelined, and often forced out. Even when they are proven right, even when they expose genuine wrongdoing, they pay a price. Some of the Nissan executives who helped build the case against Ghosn face exactly this. They were praised publicly, but privately their careers were complicated. Colleagues viewed them with suspicion. Were they heroes who exposed corruption, or opportunists who used legal accusations to settle corporate scores? The truth, again, was probably both. They may have been motivated by genuine concern about misconduct, but they also stood to benefit from Ghosn's removal. Corporate politics and legal ethics are rarely cleanly separated. What is clear is that without them, Ghosn might still be running the alliance. The fraud, if it was fraud, might have continued indefinitely. Whistleblowers, whatever their motivations, are often the only mechanism that stops misconduct when other systems fail, but protecting whistleblowers is hard. Laws exist, but they are inconsistent and often inadequate. Retaliation is common, and in many cases the personal cost of speaking up is simply too high. The Ghosn case became a case study in this tension. The people who exposed him risked everything. The man they exposed fled rather than face trial, and the system that was supposed to protect both justice and due process struggled to do either. One of the most surreal aspects of the Ghosn saga is how it became entertainment. The escape in the music box was so cinematic that it felt scripted. Multiple production companies raced to develop films and documentaries about the case. Books were written, podcasts dissected every angle. The story had everything: corporate intrigue, international fugitives, cultural clashes, luxury and excess, a daring escape. But the real people affected by it, employees who lost jobs, shareholders who lost value, the executives whose lives were upended, were not entertained. For them, it was not a thriller. It was a betrayal. The commercialization of the scandal raised ethical questions. Should someone's downfall be turned into content? Should a fugitive from justice be given a platform to tell his side of the story in exchange for book deals and interview fees? Ghosn himself participated in the media circus. He gave lengthy interviews. He cooperated with documentary filmmakers. He wrote a book framing himself as a victim. He used the media to fight a battle he could not fight in court. Whether that was effective is debatable. It kept him in the public eye. It allowed him to present his version of events. But it also reinforced the image of a man more interested in controlling the narrative than in facing accountability. The companies he left behind eventually moved on, but not without scars. Nissan appointed new leadership that promised a fresh start, but the company struggled, sales declined, profitability suffered. The vision and momentum that Ghosn had built dissipated. Some of this was inevitable. The auto industry was going through massive disruption: electric vehicles, autonomous driving, changing consumer preferences. Nissan, like many legacy automakers, struggled to adapt, but some of it was self-inflicted. The scandal damaged the brand, the leadership vacuum created instability, and the broken alliance with Renault meant Nissan faced these challenges more isolated than it would have under a unified strategy. Renault, too, faced difficulties. The company cycled through leadership. Profits fluctuated. The French government, which owned a significant stake, exerted pressure on strategy and direction. The once celebrated alliance became a source of friction rather than strength. Mitsubishi, the smallest partner, faded further into the background, struggling to find relevance in a market increasingly dominated by larger players with more resources. The automotive empire that Ghosn had built was crumbling, not collapsing but weakening. The vision of a unified global powerhouse had been replaced by three companies loosely tied together, each pursuing its own survival. And Ghosn, the architect of that vision, could only watch from Beirut, powerless to intervene, his legacy dissolving in real time. The comparison to other corporate fugitives is instructive. Ghosn is not the first executive to flee prosecution, and he will not be the last, but his case is unique in scale and audacity. The escape itself, hidden in a box, smuggled through airport security, flown across continents, was unprecedented for a corporate defendant. It captured imaginations precisely because it seemed impossible. Other fugitives had fled through legal means, exploiting extradition loopholes or negotiating deals. Ghosn's escape was brazen, almost theatrical, and it reinforced the perception that he operated outside normal boundaries. That perception is both his strength and his weakness. It keeps him in the public conversation, but it also makes it harder for people to see him as a victim rather than a fugitive. The longer he stays in exile, the more his story fades from urgent news to historical footnote. The companies move on, the industry evolves, and Carlos Ghosn becomes a cautionary tale rather than a current event. But the questions his case raised remain urgent. How do we hold powerful executives accountable when they operate across borders? How do we balance the need for strong leadership with the need for oversight? How do we prevent corporate governance from becoming celebrity worship? These are not abstract questions. They shape how companies are run, how capital is allocated, how economies function. And the Ghosn case, with all its complexity and ambiguity, offers no easy answers. It only offers a warning that power, unchecked, will eventually be abused, that success does not guarantee integrity, and that when the reckoning comes, the people at the top will do almost anything to avoid facing it. Carlos Ghosn saved Nissan. He built an empire. He became a legend. And then he lost it all. Not in a courtroom where guilt or innocence could be determined, but in a limbo of his own choosing. Whether history remembers him as a hero or a fraud will depend on who tells the story, but one thing is certain: he will be remembered, not for what he built, but for how it ended. In a box, on a plane, beyond the reach of justice. The human cost of the Ghosn scandal extended to people whose names never made headlines. Workers at Nissan plants who had endured restructuring and layoffs under Ghosn's leadership felt a particular kind of betrayal. They had been told the cuts were necessary, that survival required sacrifice, that everyone had to tighten their belts for the good of the company, and they had believed it because Ghosn was the man who saved Nissan. If he said it was necessary, it must be true. Then they learned he had allegedly been living in luxury homes around the world paid for by the company, that he had allegedly hidden millions in compensation, that while they were being asked to sacrifice, he was allegedly treating corporate funds as personal wealth. The sense of betrayal was visceral. These were not abstract financial crimes. They were violations of the implicit contract between leaders and workers. The idea that we are all in this together, that sacrifice is shared, that leadership means serving the organization, not yourself. When that contract is broken, when leaders are revealed to have been enriching themselves while demanding sacrifice from others, trust collapses, and once collapsed, it is nearly impossible to rebuild. Some workers became cynical. They stopped believing in corporate mission statements, in appeals to loyalty, in promises that short-term pain would lead to long-term gain. They had been burned, and they would not be burned again. Others simply left. They found work elsewhere, unwilling to stay at a company whose leadership had been exposed as corrupt. The talent drain was quiet but real, and it compounded Nissan's challenges in the years after the scandal. For middle managers caught between senior leadership and the workforce, the scandal created impossible positions. They had defended Ghosn's decisions. They had repeated his messaging. They had told their teams that the restructuring was necessary and fair. Now those assurances looked like lies. Even if the managers had believed them at the time, even if they had been deceived just like everyone else, their credibility was damaged. They had been Ghosn's representatives, and his fall tainted them too. Rebuilding that credibility required time, transparency, and a willingness to admit that the old leadership had failed. Some managers succeeded, others never recovered the trust of their teams. The suppliers and partners who worked with Nissan also felt the aftershocks. Ghosn had renegotiated supplier contracts aggressively during the turnaround, squeezing costs to improve Nissan's margins. Some suppliers had resented the pressure, but accepted it because Nissan was a major customer and Ghosn was seen as a visionary. When the scandal broke, some of those suppliers reconsidered their relationships. If Nissan's leadership had been corrupt, if the company's financial health had been misrepresented, what did that mean for the contracts and commitments in place? Some relationships survived, others frayed. The scandal introduced uncertainty into a supply chain that depends on stability and trust. Investors, particularly institutional investors, faced difficult reckonings. Many had invested in Nissan and Renault specifically because of Ghosn. His track record was the reason to believe these companies could compete globally. When that track record was called into question, when the architect of the turnaround was revealed to have allegedly been corrupt, the investment thesis collapsed. Fund managers who had championed Nissan and Renault faced questions from their own stakeholders. Why had they not seen the warning signs? Why had they been so willing to bet on one man? The answers were uncomfortable. They had been seduced by the narrative. They had wanted to believe in the turnaround story. They had treated Ghosn's celebrity as validation rather than a risk factor, and they had failed to ask the hard questions about governance, about oversight, about whether one person should ever have as much power as Ghosn had accumulated. That failure was not unique to Ghosn. It is a recurring pattern in corporate investing. Charismatic leaders attract capital, their confidence is contagious, their success creates momentum, and investors, eager to be part of the next big thing, overlook red flags because the returns look good, until they do not, and then the reckoning is brutal. For business schools and corporate governance experts, the Ghosn case became required study. It offered lessons on everything from board structure to executive compensation to cross-cultural management, but the lessons were hard to apply in practice, because the conditions that enabled Ghosn, a celebrity CEO, weak oversight, a board that deferred to his judgment, are not aberrations. They are features of how many corporations operate. Boards are often staffed with people who lack the time or expertise to challenge management. Executive compensation is designed to reward growth, not sustainability or ethics. And celebrity CEOs are celebrated precisely because they centralize power and make bold decisions. Changing this would require rethinking fundamental assumptions about corporate leadership. It would mean valuing humility over charisma, collective decision-making over individual genius, long-term health over short-term results. But those values are not rewarded by markets. Investors want growth. They want bold leaders. They want someone who can tell a compelling story and deliver results. And so the cycle continues. The next Carlos Ghosn is already out there, accumulating power, cutting costs, delivering results, and telling a story that investors and boards want to believe. The role of national pride in the Ghosn case also cannot be ignored. For Japan, Nissan was not just a company, it was a symbol. One of the great industrial enterprises that had rebuilt the country after World War II, that had competed globally, that represented Japanese engineering and quality. Ghosn's role in saving Nissan was both celebrated and resented. He was given credit, but he was also a reminder that a Japanese company had needed a foreigner to fix it. That cultural pride was bruised by the rescue. When the allegations emerged, some in Japan saw vindication. The foreigner who had never truly understood Japanese culture, who had broken traditions and laid off workers, was revealed to be corrupt. It confirmed suspicions that outsiders could not be trusted with Japan's corporate jewels. This narrative oversimplified a complex situation, but it resonated, and it shaped how the case was perceived within Japan. Ghosn was not just a criminal defendant, he was a symbol of foreign interference, of cultural conflict, of the risks of globalization. For France, the case was equally symbolic, but in a different way. Renault's involvement with Nissan had been a point of national pride. It was proof that French companies could compete globally, that French leadership could succeed in difficult markets. Ghosn's fall threatened that narrative. If he was corrupt, what did that say about the French executives and boards that had empowered him? If the alliance was a failure, what did that say about France's industrial strategy? Some in France defended Ghosn, framing his arrest as a Japanese plot to undermine French influence. Others were more critical, seeing his alleged misconduct as an embarrassment that damaged France's reputation. The geopolitical dimension added layers of complexity to an already tangled case. It was not just about one man's guilt or innocence. It was about corporate sovereignty, national pride, and the tensions that arise when companies operate across borders and cultures. Carlos Ghosn's own reflections on the case, shared in interviews in his book, paint a picture of a man who sees himself as a victim. He describes his detention in Japan as inhumane. He argues the charges were fabricated. He insists he was targeted for political reasons. There is truth in some of those claims. Japan's detention system is harsh. The conviction rate is extraordinarily high. The timing of his arrest was suspicious, but his narrative conveniently omits key questions. Even if the process was flawed, were the underlying accusations true? Did he hide compensation? Did he misuse corporate funds? Did he treat the companies he ran as personal assets? Ghosn's refusal to answer those questions in court, his choice to flee rather than face trial, undermines his claims of innocence. Victims do not usually run, they fight. They demand their day in court. They trust that the truth will prevail. Ghosn chose exile. and in doing so, he ensured that the truth, whatever it is, will remain contested. His life in Beirut is comfortable by most standards, but it is not the life he had. He cannot travel freely. He cannot reclaim his corporate roles. He cannot restore his reputation. He is a man in limbo, caught between defiance and irrelevance. He gives interviews, but they reach fewer people each year. He releases statements, but they generate less attention. The world has moved on. The companies have moved on. And Carlos Ghosn, once one of the most powerful executives on the planet, has become a footnote. The legacy of Carlos Ghosn is now defined not by the companies he saved, but by how he fell. Not by the turnarounds he engineered, but by the allegations he fled. That is the cost of choosing exile over accountability. It ensures that doubt will always linger, that your achievements will always be shadowed by questions, that your story will end not with vindication but with ambiguity. For those who believed in him, employees, investors, partners, the lesson is painful, trust is fragile, leaders are fallible, and the difference between a hero and a fraud can be thinner than anyone wants to admit. For those who come after him, the next generation of CEOs, the next turnaround artists, the next executives accumulating power, the lesson is a warning. Success does not grant immunity. Charisma does not replace accountability. And when the moment comes to face consequences, the choices you make will define you more than any quarterly result ever could. Carlos Ghosn saved Nissan, then he allegedly betrayed it. Then he fled, and now he sits in Beirut, beyond the reach of the law, beyond the reach of the companies he once led, beyond the reach of the legacy he once controlled. Whether that makes him a victim or a fugitive, a hero or a fraud, depends on what you choose to believe, but it makes him undeniably a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked, when success becomes its own justification, and when accountability is treated as optional. The next Carlos Ghosn is already out there, the next corporate empire is being built, the next turnaround story is being told. The question is whether anyone will ask the hard questions before it is too late, or whether we will wait once again until the music stops, the box is opened, and the fugitive is already gone. Carlos Ghosn is still in Beirut. The arrest warrant is still active. The truth is still contested. He saved one of the world's largest car companies, turned around an empire on the brink of collapse, and became one of the most celebrated executives of his generation. Then he was accused of stealing from the very companies he led, of hiding millions in compensation, of treating corporate treasuries as personal accounts, of living in luxury while demanding sacrifice from workers. And when the reckoning came, he did not stay to defend himself. He did not trust the process. He did not face his accusers in court. He climbed into a box, was smuggled onto a plane, and disappeared into a country that would not send him back. That choice defines him now, not the turnarounds, not the billions in value created, not the thousands of jobs saved, the escape, the refusal to answer, the life in exile. Whether he was guilty of everything he was accused of, we will never know, because he chose not to let the evidence be tested. He chose not to let a court decide. He chose freedom over vindication. And in doing so, he ensured that doubt would follow him forever, for the employees who believed in him, for the investors who trusted him, for the partners who worked with him. The lesson is brutal. The man who saved Nissan may also have betrayed it. The leader who demanded loyalty may not have deserved it. The genius may have been a fraud, or maybe he was targeted. Maybe the system was rigged. Maybe he fled not from justice, but from a trial he could never win. We will never know. And that ambiguity is its own kind of damage, because corporate leadership depends on trust. When that trust is broken, when leaders are revealed or even suspected of treating companies as personal fiefdoms, the cost is not just financial, it is cultural. It is the erosion of the belief that working hard, playing by the rules, and trusting the system will lead to fairness. Carlos Ghosn shattered that belief for everyone connected to Nissan, Renault, and the alliance he built. And the systems that were supposed to prevent this, boards, auditors, regulators, failed. They deferred to his success. They assumed his results justified his power. They did not ask the hard questions until it was too late. That failure is not unique to Ghosn. It is structural. It happens again and again because we celebrate bold leaders. We reward centralizing power in the hands of individuals who deliver growth. We treat skepticism as disloyalty and questions as obstacles. And then, when it all falls apart, we act surprised. The next Carlos Ghosn is already out there. Maybe in tech, maybe in finance, maybe in another corner of the global economy where a charismatic leader is accumulating power, cutting costs, delivering results, and telling a story that boards and investors want to believe, the warning signs will be there, the same ones that were visible with Ghosn: excessive centralization of power, weak oversight, deference to a celebrity CEO, a board that does not ask hard questions because the stock price is rising, and those warning signs will be ignored because success is intoxicating, because challenging a winning leader feels risky, because no one wants to be the person who kills the golden goose. Until one day the music stops, the box is open and the leader is gone. Carlos Ghosn made a choice. He chose exile over accountability, comfort over confrontation, a life in Beirut over a trial in Tokyo. That choice tells you everything you need to know, not about his guilt, that remains contested, but about his character, about what he valued more than his reputation, about what he was willing to sacrifice to avoid facing the consequences. He saved Nissan, he built an empire, he became a legend, and then, when the moment came to defend that legacy in the place where truth is supposed to be tested, a courtroom with evidence and cross-examination and a verdict, he ran. He is free, but he is also trapped, unable to travel, unable to reclaim his life, unable to clear his name, and the companies he once led have moved on without him. His name erased, his achievements overshadowed, his legacy reduced to a single image, a man hidden in a box fleeing in the night. That is how the story of Carlos Ghosn ends, not with vindication, not with conviction, but with escape. And the question that remains is not whether he was guilty, it is what we learn from the fact that he was able to rise so high, fall so hard, and disappear so completely, while the systems meant to prevent it all stood by and watched. The next time a CEO promises to save a company, demands unchecked power, and delivers results that look too good to question, remember Carlos Ghosn, remember the man who saved Nissan, and remember the man who fled in a box rather than answer for what he had done.